In light of what we've already done and just read together this morning, in light of these images that surround us today, it feels good and right to have named this message Roots and Wings. Because indeed, this morning we have come together and we have replanted some roots, and we have started to spread our wings again. Now, I think some of us may know what the phrase roots and wings often refers to. It's one of Shanda and Jill's favorite phrases, so I'm guessing, since they're kind of talkative, you may have heard this phrase at some point before. And when they use it to mean that in life we need both roots and wings. Roots in the sense that we need to be grounded in something. We need to have convictions. We need to have community. We need to be dedicated to our families. We need to have a sense of place. And wings in the sense that we need to be equipped to fly, to explore, to blaze new trails, to learn from our failures, to do things that take us well beyond the boundaries of what we grew up in. It's a great phrase, and it points to a lot of truth. In fact, it even points to biblical truth. But this morning, I'm going to invite us to explore that common phrase when we look at it in two very specific biblical texts, Psalm 1 and Isaiah 40. These passages will point us to another way the Bible actually talks about roots, and another way that the Bible talks about wings. And in exploring how the Bible uses these two phrases, these two images, and these two places, we're going to take a look at what the Bible can show us about roots and wings. Something that should affirm for us how we've experienced and navigated these past 15 months, and something that should affirm how I think many of us are experiencing this morning right now, and something that should encourage us to hold on to this memory of it all, of what we've just lived through. Hold on to it for maybe years, maybe generations ahead. Hold on to this memory of how we navigated these past 15 months so that we might find hope that we can carry with us in this still all too often broken world. So let's explore this biblical way of thinking about roots and wings together. If you love the way that Shanda and Jill use the phrase, don't worry, this doesn't mean you have to throw that away. But I hope for all of us that from now on, when you hear the words roots and wings, today's service might also come to mind. And you might also remember this other beautiful, gritty, and absolutely essential truth that we can carry with us in the world. Now, Psalm 1 opens up the entire book of Psalms with a beautiful image of a flourishing tree, a tree offering a canopy of lush green leaves, a tree overflowing with delicious fruit that is ripe for the picking, all because it has been planted by a stream. Now, of course, this is poetic language in which we are the tree. And so, what is this stream that can make us like this beautiful tree? Well, the psalm tells us that we are like that tree by that stream when we meditate on God's law. To bring roots into the equation, we are the tree, the water is God's law, and our roots are our meditations, the part of us that reaches out to where we can be nourished by the water of God's law. Now, imagine that many of us love that imagery, but maybe some of us shiver a little when it comes to that word law. Is the psalm just pointing us to legalism? Well, actually, the original word that gets translated to law in most of our Bibles is Torah, as in those who meditate on the Torah will be like trees planted by streams of water. What's the Torah? It's the title the psalmist and the other original audience would have used for the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And while there are certainly some do's and don'ts in those books, what's there, first and foremost, is a story of God's people and a lot of reminders to remember that story. Genesis, first and foremost, tells the story of God's intentions for all of creation. Then Exodus tells the dramatic story of God's deep love for God's people when they were enslaved, of rescuing them from oppression, setting them free. Now, granted, when we get to books like Deuteronomy, it starts to feel a little bit more like a legal code, but if you look closely, you'll see that Deuteronomy, before it says anything else, opens with a long retelling of the people's story. And then it prefaces its lists of do's and don'ts with commands to remember. Remember God who brought you out of Egypt. Remember God who led you through the desert. Remember God by remembering your story. All of which is to say, when Psalm 1 tells us those who meditate on the Torah will be like trees planted by streams of water, one really helpful understanding of this is those who remember their story with God will be like trees planted by a stream of water. Or, in other words, those who remember their roots will be like trees planted by streams of water. Because what is remembering your roots if not remembering your story? Which, in our case, should be God's story, including the story that came before us and the story we continue to live in. Remember your roots, Psalm 1 instructs. Remember your story. Remember God's story. Now, in the Old Testament, the part of God's story that we are often advised to remember is the story of Exodus, the story of God's people being led out of slavery, which calls us to some big things. That story challenges us with still relevant questions like, how should we treat one another and others if we remember that in the story we've been grafted into graciously, our people were once slaves, but that God sided with us as the oppressed and opposed that exploitative economy? What does that say about how we do business with one another and our neighbors? What does that say about how we view work and rest and our economic system, which can give more and more to a few at the cost of many? But as Christians, our scriptures also contain the gospel. So when we are called to remember our story, we are called as much as anything to remember this, that Jesus died on Good Friday, that his followers lived through the dark despair of Saturday, before finally discovering on Sunday that Jesus was indeed alive again. In other words, as Christians, we are invited to remember our story, and that story is like this. In a world full of pain, agony, and loss, it's real. The pain is real, and it hits hard. But when it hits, that victory might even linger over us for a while, but even when there is no earthly reason to believe that the pain, agony, and loss will end, God shows us that a new beginning always comes. For us as Christians, the gospel is our clearest way of knowing this, but as with every good thing in the gospel, it was also already there in the Old Testament all along. You could say, in fact, that this is the main message of the prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah, who time and again and in deeply poetic and dramatic language say pain and hardship is on its way. It's really going to hurt. You're going to need to accept that when it comes, not deny it or resist it, but then eventually God will give you a new beginning. In fact, when we only explore this concept with the gospel story, we can sometimes forget how long our times of hardship in this world can actually be. After all, Saturday, the day between Jesus' death and resurrection, is just one day. The prophets remind us that hard times like that can sometimes last for a very long time. Let's put it another way. The prophets should help us to remember that the time between the death and the resurrection can last an excruciatingly long time. That when we face hard times and are waiting for new beginnings, we must sometimes endure a very long Saturday. But like the gospel, the message of the prophets doesn't end with pain and waiting, because after describing all that pain and loss and how very, very long it can last, Jeremiah and Isaiah encourage God's people to accept it, not to deny it, but to also see its potential to disrupt the evils of the world and to bring new beginning. They offer incredible hope with passages like this one, sounding like it was written to those who've almost lost all hope already. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told to you from the beginning? Why do you say God's forgotten us? Because God will give power to the faint. God will strengthen the powerless. Yes, it can get so bad that even youths faint from exhaustion, but those who wait upon God shall have their strength renewed. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. All of which is to say, passages like Psalm 1 call us to remember our roots, God's story for us. And when we remember our roots, we should remember that just as the prophets described and just as Jesus died, pain, loss, and agony will sometimes seem to have won. And they may sometimes seem to have won for a very long time. But in that story, we will also find that time and again, and thanks to Jesus for all time and forever, we should know that through all that pain and loss, God is offering us a new beginning. A new beginning that can change some of what was wrong and unjust before all that pain. A new beginning, to put it poetically, that will lift all of us who have waited high into the sky like we have the wings of eagles. Okay, so that's a lot of biblical analysis, right? At this point in my message, you might be wondering, okay, sure, roots and wings. God tells us to remember our story, and that story reminds us that through long periods of disruption and difficulty, God can offer us the wings to rise up to new beginnings. But what does that all mean for us today? Why am I preaching about that today? Well, here's why. Here's what I want to say. Friends, COVID's arrival was a taste of the loss and despair of Good Friday, wasn't it? The last 15 months have been like living through a very long Saturday. A very long period of loss, pain, disruption, right? I know that for all of us, these last 15 months have been brutally hard. Some days, some weeks, and some months better for some of us. But overall, it's been hard. Some of us have lost loved ones. Some of us fear we've lost relationships with close friends or family. Most of us have had moments being profoundly lonely. Most of us have felt the crush of what Cindy Wallace, in her sermon to us, described as moral distress. That feeling that so much wrong is happening out in that world and there's nothing we can do about it. But finally, today, I think many of us, in seeing one another in person like this, are feeling a little like we might be growing wings again. Like God is lifting us back to our feet and maybe even up into the air. Like we are finally starting to see that we have survived Saturday and that Sunday is here. That we are at a new beginning. Which is to say, if you felt deeply wounded by all the pain of the past 15 months, if those wounds are still there even this morning, don't forget your roots. Because your roots will show you that God has not abandoned you. They will show you that what you have gone through is right there in God's story. It is part of God's story. And if you feel profound joy this morning, maybe joy that currently eclipses all that pain of the past 15 months, or maybe joy that just kind of coexists with all that pain at the same time, let that too be a reminder of your roots, of the story that assures us that even if pain can go on and on and on sometimes, even when pain sometimes seems to have won, God will give us a new beginning. God will raise us up on wings. Because here's the beautiful thing about what we've just experienced and about what we're experiencing today. When we are called to remember our roots, to remember God's story and how we live in it, we are called to remember the story of God's people in the Old Testament. We are called to remember the story of God's people in the gospel for sure. And we are called to remember God's story as we have lived it out in our time and place too. Which means that Having lived through what we just lived through, having trusted God through it, having faced the pain of the pandemic head on, not denying it, but instead accepting the reality of it, hard as it was, and thereby being able to see each other's pain during it, to bear that pain together while waiting all the time for a God of new beginnings. Having lived through all of that, we have now had a powerful experience that we can remember whenever we meditate on our roots. That for 15 months, over the course of 2020 and 2021, we lived through a time of deeper collective despair than many of us had ever known. By refusing to live in denial or to pretend everything was okay, by comforting one another through it, by continuing to try to live right, by asking what opportunities exist in this that could bring more love and justice to the world, by continuing to trust in God and the gospel, we eventually got to this place where we can taste some of the resurrection, where we can spread our wings again. Friends, as you well know, it's not all happy news out there right now. The hard truth in Scripture and the writing on the wall of our nation and our world is that there are more Saturdays, more hard times ahead. The past year has reminded us that our nation is still going to have to figure out how it faces the consequences of its unjust past and present. And it's shown us that those who wish to avoid that reckoning are not facing that truth willingly. This past year has also yet again reminding us that our natural world is at a breaking point. Another reckoning that it sometimes feels like many are refusing to face. In other words, the pandemic is not the last or the only Saturday we are living through. But as we face those hard times too, we now have this. We have the memory of our roots. We have what the psalmist calls the law. We have the gospel, and we now have the memory of how we got through COVID, all of reminding us that if we don't run from or deny the pain, if we accept it with God's spirit of honesty, solidarity, and sacrifice, if we look for how it could disrupt the injustices of the world too, we can also live with the hope of new beginnings. We can do all these things knowing that Saturday does give way to Easter Sunday. We can do all these things knowing that even when it seems like we have nothing but exhaustion ahead of us, even when it does lead to exhaustion, our God will give us wings. And so, given that, let's continue to celebrate this beautiful Sunday. Not like those who think no hardship will ever come again, but like those who know their roots. Those who know that whatever comes, we have God's story, and we have our memory of these past 15 months and of today to continue to give us courage, integrity, and strength to lift us up on the wings of an eagle.